Americanism, not globalism, will be our credo. Many of you probably saw Donald Trump's acceptance speech about a week ago in Cleveland, and whether you like Mr. Trump or not, he has a knack of capturing the zeitgeist. And certainly that particular sentence captures a wider trend in advanced economies such as the United States, the UK, and elsewhere, turning away from globalism, from the liberal order which came about in the ruins of the Second World War, and some kind of a turning inward or looking inward, Americanism in the case of the United States, or Brexit in the case of the UK, and so on. So there's a different debate to be had here about whether there is some underlying pattern here, or these are sort of disparate events. But from the point of view of a trade economist, which is the hat that I wear professionally, this is a very interesting development. There is a rise or a return of a trend towards protectionism, or at least protectionist rhetoric, if not as yet a lot in the way of protectionist action, although action sometimes follows words. And again, those of you following developments in the US and UK and elsewhere are aware that a lot of political rhetoric focuses on the inherent unfairness of trade agreements and so on. And in the US in particular, in fact, neither of the major candidates really has made a forthright defense. Well, quite the opposite, has attacked the principles of free trade and our global trading system. And even Mrs. Clinton, of course, has moved to the left in response to the Sanders faction who has pushed her to the left. And so really neither, and for famously, of course, retracted her support for the TPP, which she once called the gold standard of trade agreements. Now she's no longer in favor of it. And Trump's views are very clear. So, of course, a cry for protectionism by vote-seeking politicians is not new at all. We've seen this movie before, and perhaps part of what I do, and so the students who are here, is go a little bit into the history of this. The new protectionism is not really new at all. It's couched in new terminology in some senses, but it's not new at all. We can go back centuries, but let's at least go back to the great stock market crash of 1929 and the trade war, the tit-for-tat tariff escalations, which followed it, the great stock market crash, which, as we all know, made the Great Depression much worse, much deeper, and in its own way sowed the seeds for the rise of fascism and the Second World War. Now, again, as we all know, or at least as we ought to recall, in large measure as a direct result of the advanced economy's disastrous experience with tariff escalations and trade war, out of the rubble of the Second World War came a sort of a trifecta of institutions, or many more, but the World Bank, the IMF, and the GATT, now the WTO, as a rules-based system to govern international trade, the rules of international trade, in which, at least in theory, everyone is an equal participant. And of course, the WTO still operates on the consensus principle, unlike other institutions. Imperfect it may be, and as trade economists or trade policy people were aware of the GATT and the WTO system's many failings, but imperfect as it was, the GATT-WTO did indeed prevent any kind of repetition of the major tariff war, which we saw during the 1930s. It has not, however, prevented creeping protectionism, which is what is often called by economists who looked at this, a situation in which non-tariff barriers, such as subsidies, quotas, domestic procurement requirements, and so on, are used as surrogates or substitutes for tariffs. Again, those of you who have studied international trade know that if you're disallowed from using a trade policy instrument, a tariff, for instance, There are other domestic policy instruments which can mimic the effect of a tariff, have the same impact, but often they're much worse, they're much more distorting in their effects. The 1970s in particular witnessed a period of malaise in the advanced economies following the Nixon shock, the closing of the gold window. That's a whole other saga, and I won't want to delve into that, although I've written about it quite a lot. And the OPEC shocks. And one saw a drift upward, both of protectionist rhetoric and of sort of protectionism in the form of non-tariff measures. And what one got was a kind of system that really wasn't free trade, nor was it autarky or protectionism, but kind of a managed trade system. Of course, the multi-fiber agreement is the most famous example of that, which students will know about. Now, I want to turn the clock back to another presidential campaign in the US, which was just about as exciting as the one that we're going through now, which was 1992, and the last major bout of protectionist rhetoric that flared up in the United States. Some of you will recall the 1992 presidential campaign in which Governor Bill Clinton of Arkansas saw off the incumbent President George H.W. Bush, and of course trade and income inequality and so on. All of these things that we think are new that Mr. Piketty has suddenly discovered were in fact, in their own way, the topics both of intellectual debate and of the 1992 presidential campaign. You'll recall, and I recall very strongly watching the debates, and Ross Perot, who was the spoiler candidate, the third-party candidate or the independent candidate, talking about a giant sucking sound as American jobs were sucked to Mexico through the NAFTA, which had been agreed upon but not yet ratified by the United States. So what I'm going to suggest, without belaboring the point, is that we've seen this movie before. The current debates in the US and elsewhere are not new, and we might learn some lessons if we look back at this recent episode in the US, in which I myself took part in this debate. Bhagwati and I were certainly interlocutors in this particular debate. And as you also know, after Bill Clinton won a landslide election victory in 1992, he surrounded himself with protectionist sounding economists, economists who had taken a tough stand on trade, who had warned about the fear of those days was Japan, not China, but it's again same story, different Asian country painted as the villain. And so these were economists like Laura Tyson, Joe Stiglitz, Nobel laureate, and so on. Paul Krugman was not part of the administration, but philosophically, spiritually played an important role in shaping their thinking. And of course, as you know, the boom which followed, which really burst with the global financial crisis, then put trade again on the back burner. I just thought that the era of globalization had arrived, was inevitable, was invincible, could never be rolled back, and so on. And of course, in the immediate aftermath of the global financial crisis, it was macroeconomic and financial issues which came to the fore. So again, trade policy issues, trade policy remained on the back burner. But now that the United States is in the midst of a shaky recovery, the latest numbers, of course, don't look brilliant, but attention has again turned in election season to international trade and to the rise of the so-called new protectionism, which, as I've said, is not very new. And so part of what I suggest those of you who find this topic of interest is look back at the debates that we've had. And look back in particular at the debates we had in the early 1990s, because what we're seeing in many ways is a replay of those debates in somewhat different language. And if you recall, in those days, the view being put forward by a group of economists and championed by Bill Clinton, the campaigner, was that somehow globalization through international trade, so the freeing up of trade barriers, opened the US economy to a flood of cheap imports. And this was the reason why American proletarian wages, blue-collar wages and employment were stagnating. So very much exactly what you're hearing now, but in somewhat different language. And a very heated and spirited debate broke out both among academic economists, policy analysts, and so on, between those such as Krugman, Tyson, and so on, who felt that trade indeed was the major culprit, and people like Bhagwati and myself, and a few others who said, no, the real culprit isn't international trade, not globalization or freeing up of trade, but it is the nature of technological change. It's the fact that new technologies tend to be capital intensive and skill intensive, and so therefore a shift in the structure of technological change and the structure of production is the real culprit. And this is also tied to this whole debate about deindustrialization, which you raised. Danny Roderick, one of my old professors at Columbia, is most associated with this term, but he of course didn't discover it. Nick Kaldor, Lord Kaldor, back in 1966, talked about premature maturity of the UK economy, which is where it first showed up in modern literature. But again, that debate swung back and forth. But I think it's fair to say that for a number of years, the mainstream consensus was that it was technology which was the key driver, not international trade. That pendulum has begun to swing back the other way, with the view, and I must say in hindsight, perhaps I myself was a little too sanguine in dismissing the role of a conventional trade-driven channel as a driver of the stagnation of blue-collar wages, of the hollowing out of industry, and so on, the things that we talked about in your very sweeping and broad overview on that. Now, I want to just, again, there's a vast literature on this. I want to pinpoint what I think is a particularly interesting intellectual transition in this debate, where perhaps the thinking started to shift back. Some of you will know what I think is or should be a classic 2006 article by Alan Blinder, the economist Alan Blinder, in Foreign Affairs, a very influential policy journal. Blinder also was part of the Tyson Council in Bill Clinton's first term by the Reagans, later a Fed board member, and very influential in Democratic Party circles. But Blinder, picking up on a number of different strands of work, including work by Bhagwati and myself, argued that, this came up earlier today, that the old distinction between tradable and non-tradable had become blurred and had to be redefined. In fact, you raised it before when you talked about the GST. So again, conventional old-fashioned trade theory, we assume that goods are tradable and services are not. And Blinder argued that that old distinction now was no longer so relevant, but in this digital sort of age, and this maybe looks ahead to this evening's keynote, what was increasingly relevant, Blinder argued, was a distinction between goods and services which could be either transported cheaply or delivered effectively, digitally or otherwise, which could be outsourced in the language we use today, and those which could not be. And what's interesting about this is this new conception of can this be easily outsourced or not cuts across the old distinction of tradable versus non-tradable, good versus service, again, and as an unintended consequence, I believe, although Blinder has been accused of being a protectionist, sort of veiled protectionist, created new fodder for would-be protectionists. Because the thrust of the Blinder distinction is that the types of jobs which would be, if you like, more or less immune from international competition would be, interestingly, at the lower end and the upper end. Everyone in the middle would be vulnerable to his or her job being outsourced, what they're doing being outsourced to China, India, or somewhere else. So a factory worker or a radiologist could both be easily outsourced, right? Or the service they provide be outsourced. But interestingly enough, a cab driver or a construction worker not, because the service they provide is so low on the value chain, it's simply not cost effective to outsource cab driving to some sort of drone operator sitting here in Bangalore. It's just not going to work. It's not going to be feasible, it's going to be too expensive. So for now, at least, unless a new robot comes on stream tomorrow. Cab drivers are safe, construction workers are safe, cement industry is safe, low value added, right? And at the upper end of the value spectrum, for example, a celebrity psychiatrist of a type I hope you don't need to consult, his or her position cannot be outsourced, because at that level, the intimate one-to-one contact, the face-to-face contact with the service provider is a perquisite and a part of the package of services which are being offered, right? So that is also secure. So this was sort of the thrust of what Blinder said. And so the logic of his vision, and we not yet gotten to this world, is some kind of almost science fiction apocalyptic world, where a few celebrity psychiatrists are being serviced by a few cab drivers and a few blue-collar service jobs, and everything else been outsourced to China and India. Now, we haven't yet gotten to that world, but some recent research, and those of you who want to look, see a chapter in verse can look at the short paper I circulated, suggests that economists, people like me, for instance, in the 1990s, were perhaps a little too sanguine on how quickly the labor market could adjust to a major trade shock. So the work of economists, particularly David Autor of MIT, is one of the leaders of this particular new stream of research, suggests that the US labor market, which don't forget is the most dynamic in the world, itself at the local level is very slow to adjust. People just don't like to move, even if they could earn a higher wage by moving. So their argument is what they call the China shock has had a much longer run impact on the US labor market, and therefore much sharper and deeper and longer lasting adjustment costs than conventional textbook economic theory or trade theory would suggest, which suggests relatively rapid adjustment, particularly in labor markets. And so again, they don't explicitly come out with protectionist policy implications, but protectionists are quick to seize on this kind of research, to say, aha, I told you. This is globalization is much worse than you trade economists and you trade policy advocates suggested to us. Therefore, we need to roll it back. Now, that's the wrong policy advice, but that's an easy one to come to. Now, this is where I must say advocates for free trade, for openness, for globalization have done a poor job. And I think economists themselves, policy advocates, free trade advocates, sometimes in a good cause overstate the case for free trade and thereby in the long run intellectually damage the case for free trade, right? Because this is where a basic dose of economic theory has to meet the rhetoric. So no sensible person, no credible economist will say that free trade is always good for everyone. That's never been the case. In fact, for the students here, those of you who has seen the Ricardian model, the two good, one factor, there's a very good reason why David Ricardo had only one factor of production in that model. Because there are no distributional impacts in a world of one factor of production. So what's good for labor is good for the economy and vice versa. Right? In fact, Ricardo this is a little footnote, was very much aware of the distributional impacts of trade, and his fuller model with capital, labor, and land, that distributional impact comes out. But rhetorically, Ricardo wanted to make the case for free trade in a simple world where if free trade is good for the economy, it's good for everyone, right? But we know that isn't the case. We know that trade has distributional impacts. There are winners and there are losers, right? What we can say is, again, absent market failures, absent large-scale distortions, that the economy as a whole is likely to gain. And if that is the case, then, at least in principle, in some sense, the losers from free trade could be compensated, and the winners still come out at the classic Pareto optimality principle, right? But that's very different from saying that everyone necessarily gains right away from the opening up of free trade. In fact, we know in the U.S. case what has driven a lot of the anger and resentment, what feeds the Trump phenomenon or Brexit, are disgruntled, and rightly disgruntled, blue-collar workers who've seen their incomes, their wages stagnate, who have not seen adjustment assistance and so on. And they have not seen any one of their advocates for free trade making a case that, a more nuanced case, that yes, on the whole, in the aggregate, free trade is good for the economy, make a principled case on that basis, but that losers must be compensated and must be worried about, must be looked after. That was swept under the rug during the heyday of sort of the excitement about globalization, global financial markets and so on. And that was just not talked about, and that has now come back to bite both advocates for free trade and politicians and centrist political parties in particular, who didn't worry so much about these things when the economy as a whole was growing, when there was aggregate growth, when the economy was booming. So I won't say so much more about this, but what I will say is that I think there's an important, this is where I want to segue a bit to trade policy and to India, and say that I think the view or the policy prescription or the way one looks at it has to be different in an advanced economy like the US, where I think it's right and proper to focus on the losers and to assist the losers to adjust. But I do think, and this is a much broader point, that just sort of mechanically or mindlessly taking over policy debates from an advanced economy context to an emerging economy like India is fundamentally flawed, fundamentally mistaken. Whether it's true about trade policy or inequality, we can have terrifically fantastic intellectual debates about inequality, but I think it's a wrong policy priority for India. Our priority is poverty, not inequality, in my judgment. You may disagree. So US-style debates about inequality in essentially a stagnant economy make sense. In India, they don't. And likewise, the fixation on the losers from international trade is right and proper in the US. But in India, again, we shouldn't be distracted. Now, this piece that I've circulated, I made a very old-fashioned conservative political economy argument that you can even safely ignore the losers in some cases. I tried this out on Xavier students in Bombay. They didn't really go for the argument. But this might be a more receptive crowd for a conservative political economy argument. Now, let me quickly turn in the time I have left to trade policy and to India. Just a word on this new proliferation of so-called mega-regional deals. Now, again, you can read what I've written about this. I am not a fan of India joining up for any of these Trojan horse agreements that bring in a whole lot of other stuff that's not international trade, that's not trade policy. Of course, the real secret is, if you want to bring in stuff that's non-trade related into a trade agreement, call it trade related. And that's the best sign that it's not trade related. So, and there's been a basic degradation of the discourse in this area. One particular well-respected business newspaper in India, not one I write for, has suggested that India is backward-looking on this issue, that we should be thinking about beyond the border issues and so on. That's rubbish. Beyond the border issues is code for harmonization of standards. And that's code for you adopt our standards, right? So for India, it would be disastrously bad to say, yes, we're going to accept US intellectual property protection norms at our level of development, and given the industries in which we have comparative advantage, right? So again, intellectually for the students here, the real litmus test, right, is there a mutual gain? Again, classical conventional trade theory says that reciprocal opening up of trade or dropping of trade barriers is mutually gainful. There's mutual gain. But if India adopts US IPP norms, is there mutual gain? Not necessarily. I would say no, we can debate it. But quite possibly what you'll have is a transfer, at least in certain sectors, from India to the US. Okay? So again, we don't have time for this, but the old Westphalian distinction of what happens within your border is your lookout. You figure it out. And I have no right to tell you how to set your domestic norms, standards, laws, regulations, and so on. That distinction has become blurred and broken down for various reasons. Again, this is not new. And look back to the 1990s. and the debate about fair trade and harmonization of rules and practices. Again, the EU drove this process, as you know, and they had no choice. They had to harmonize because they had a customs union and they had the four freedoms and so on. So, but the world is not the EU, right? So there's no reason for us to accept or to, mindlessly accept the logic of harmonization. And again, this is where there's, and I hope that the group here and Indic Academy and our friend here will take a more sensible view and not simply sort of simplistically, mechanically absorb what we're being told by our friends at the think tanks in Washington, D.C. There's one particular paper which came out at the time the TPP was agreed upon, which suggests that this would be the greatest thing for India to ever do. But no one actually disclosed that this particular paper was funded by U.S. corporate interests, but that's also probably worth knowing. There's a rather well-known economist, and I won't name him for reasons of tact and discretion in this context, but not hard to find that paper. And if you read what I sent you, you will have no difficulty just identifying who this is. No, I don't think I'll do that. I'm still hoping he may invite me for a talk.
Can you guess? Can we guess the name?
So it's all in what I've circulated. So if you just read it, this is an example of where it actually does help to read. So I'll just say this, and I'll just close on this note, that we are way behind in India. And I think this is where I think we'll all agree in thinking intelligently, strategically, and in a forward-looking way about our trade policy. We're always in a defensive crouch. I think we were wrongly painted as the villain in Nairobi, but given that things played out the way they were, we didn't have much of a choice. But the point is, we're not being particularly proactive in saying, what is in India's national economic interest? To articulate a case for sectors where we would gain by opening up, and not simply reacting to, joint TPP, there's now RCEP, that China's leading. We're always reacting. And we don't have a lot of thought leadership in this area. Certainly and I write for the business press and I scan the business press. There isn't that much out there. Perhaps, present company accepted, well-known columnists who have written about this. But I think we have to up the level of discourse and think in terms of India's national strategic interest and not just sort of mindlessly repeat tropes that come our way from Washington, D.C. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.